a sound check before we...
I was going to say.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's so wonderful to see all of you here, and I'm just thrilled to be back here in Venice among friends. This was a very important part of my life for a number of years, for about a decade. My husband and I lived in Venice, and I was in a very active part of Venice Interfaith while I was here, and it became just part of my identity. It became a part of who I am. And I want to encourage all of you who are here tonight to just think about how important this organization is in the history and the collective memory of Venice going forward. And you're gonna hear that word, those two words, collective memory, over and over. You're gonna get sick and tired of hearing them tonight. But I want you to remember those two words. So how do we talk about memory? Well, I will begin by sharing a memory of Hurricane Katrina with you. I am one of the 1 million people who was displaced from New Orleans, and my home was one of the more than 1 million homes damaged during the hurricane. My family and I had evacuated the day before the hurricane blew in. The hurricane, as you probably remember, caused a massive surge on Lake Pontchartrain, which caused the levee systems to overtop and break, and that caused massive flooding throughout the metropolitan area. I have an emotional response when the events of that period of time play out in my memory, even though I was far away from the hurricane. When I know of the actual storm, I learned from mass media reporting. But I have an autobiographical memory of the frantic preparations that we undertook to evacuate. And I have a flashbulb memory that just blazes in my mind of waking up in Houston to the devastating news that the levees were breaking, and I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that my house was flooded. We lived on a street that bordered one of the levees, so there was no hope of not having water in it. More importantly, though, my own memory of Hurricane Katrina, combined with millions of other people's memories, formed a collective memory of this event. In the months following, my family had temporarily relocated to Columbus, Ohio, where we met once a month with other displaced people, and we shared our memories. It was an important part of our healing journey. But the collective memory of so many obvious failures on the part of local, state, and federal government led to reforms in disaster planning and emergency management, and to a heightened awareness of the needs of the most vulnerable populations. Well, we could say that collective memory brought people together in a positive way, in a common purpose, to achieve these reforms. In other ways, however, the collective memory of that event sharpened the divisions among social groups as they competed for financial aid and for justice in long-standing economic and social inequalities. Collective memory is an important but often invisible or misunderstood element of our social relationships. This evening, I want to share with you some ideas about how collective memory works, where we see collective memories, and especially how we can repair our broken relationships through an awareness of collective memory. By the end of the evening, my hope is that we will all say, well, I remember something this way, but you remember it differently. Let's talk. The prophet Isaiah, more than 2 millennia ago, quoted God as saying, "Do not remember the former things, or consider the things of old." Wise advice? A commandment? Or an impossible dream? And if that is so, how then shall we solve the conundrum of do not remember the former things, but in the words of George Santayana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it? Well, what is now being called the memory boom started about 50 years ago, when the concept of collective memory spawned increasing numbers of scholarly works, popular writing, new approaches to how to mark and observe collective memories, and then the development of digital formats, which have allowed us to access, share, and preserve our memories. The memory boom has given rise to intense debates about whose memories should prevail and whose will be or have been excluded. And that seems to be where we are mired today. The title of this program makes a statement about memories, why we stay this way. Well, I propose to ask it as a question. Must we stay this way? And hope to find a path that will draw us out of this quagmire. To complete the Isaiah quotation above, God declares, "I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" So what is collective memory? Well, in its most basic definition, it is the shared pool of memories of a social group, and it is often associated with that group's identity. The two are kind of linked. The concept of collective memory began to appear in English and French literature about 150 years ago, so it's not a new concept. It is a topic of interest across many disciplines: psychology, sociology, history, philosophy, anthropology, literature, and the arts, and many more. Collective memory touches on virtually every aspect of human activity, if you really think about it. So 100 years ago, a French sociologist by the name of Maurice Haubois described collective memory as the linchpin in the reciprocal relationship between past and present. They work together, they're hinged. A linchpin holds things together. It is a tool that gives us a clearer image of how collective memory works by asking, how do our memories of the past affect the present? And how does the present shape our memories of the past? Don Gifford, a literary scholar, offered another way of looking at this. He described memory as a verb that is always in the present tense, in a continuous process of mapping and remapping our present consciousness. So, as you can guess, we've dived into a very big topic. It is really hard. I struggled to put this program together just to figure out, well, what is the essential element here? It's really huge. And it's a very contentious one among scholars. Many of them have issued cautions and criticisms of this concept of collective memory. So it's an ongoing debate. Our time frame for this program constrains us from a fuller discussion, but I refer you to the readings suggested on the handouts that are on your tables if you really want to take a deeper dive into the field of collective memory. But whether or not you choose to study this topic, I just ask that you open yourself up to an awareness of the concept. Take time to see the influence of collective memory in our world and in our human relationships. So let's just take a few minutes to talk about collective memory and how it operates. It's an open system. It's fluid and ever-changing. New events enter the framework of collective memory. Older events and people are forgotten. Evidence is found or re-examined which shifts our thinking. People in power may manipulate historical interpretation to advance their agendas. What had seemed true and authentic a few years ago may now be called into question or disproved. So change is part of the human condition, and our challenge is to make change a good thing for everyone. An understanding of the power of collective memory can help us do that. Behind collective memories lie our individual memories. They can be categorized, as I mentioned earlier, as learned memories, autobiographical, and flashbulb memories. So learned memories. Think back to your history class. These are less vivid, less well retained than our memories of personal experiences or autobiographical memories. Time and place are important markers in learned memories, particularly when these memories are embedded along with an event or a visible sight that we see. What I remember about the actual Hurricane Katrina event, I learned through news media. It was filtered through somebody else's knowledge and understanding. We can summarize our learned memories then as more symbolic than experienced, more social than self-centered, and mediated through mass communication channels rather than encoded into our autobiographical life stream. Autobiographical memories are those that we have experienced directly. They are often less specific about time and place, but rich in emotional detail. They are the source of meaning in our lives, the stories that we tell ourselves, and even the nebulous figures that populate our dreams at night. My autobiographical memories of Katrina include that frantic rush to evacuate and then running after we'd gotten into the car and driven out of the driveway. I said, stop, and ran back into the house and grabbed my laptop, and boy, was I glad I had that with us. And then a flashbulb memory is seared into a person's consciousness, where it is elaborated in a search for meaning of the event, and then rehearsed and retold. The event is vivid, emotional, detailed, easy to recollect and to share. Flashbulb memories serve as a bridge between our autobiographical memories and our collective memories, as something that many people experience and remember, but in individualistic ways. For example, probably the best example that we all know is President Kennedy's assassination. We all here tonight, I know, remember in quite a bit of emotional detail our experience of watching that unfold on TV. And we can probably all recall the sound of Walter Cronkite's voice narrating that story for us. In a sense, we were all participants, feeling the same shock in the moment, and then asking the same questions about our nation's future. Yet every person in this room would tell a different version of that experience. My flashbulb memories of Katrina include hearing the awful news of the levee breaches. It was a moment of awareness of disaster for me, but I shared it with millions of people, and each one of us would describe it in different ways. So 3 key points about memory are that flashbulb memories are not 100% accurate. Police have long noted that eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable, The same is true for our recall of personal experiences of significant events. Memories are constructed and they evolve as we tell them over and over, weaving a new story each time to fit the context in which it is told. I have told my Katrina story hundreds of times, and it is different each time. True, but different. Collective memory differs by age group. The greatest recall of events is of those which occur in our late adolescence or our early adult years. Those are the ones that really stick with us. Thus, collective memory is generational. What my age group and all of us recall of President Kennedy's assassination will differ from a generation younger. And most importantly, the expressions of memory, mine, yours, and others, must be respected, but they must also be regarded and recalled that they are human products which adapt, evolve, disappear as circumstances change. So perhaps the best that we can hope for is that the memories we share will be studied and appreciated from many viewpoints. What beauty might we, in our various collective groups, our families, our houses of worship, our local community, whatever groups you belong to, a club, let's just hope that these memories that we are collecting in those groups will produce something beautiful. Or as we heard God say in the words of Isaiah, I am about to do a new thing. Do you not perceive it? Well, perceiving a memory is kind of hard to do. So how can we? How can we make the past present? Pierre Nora, a French historian, coined the term lieu de mémoire. It's a term of art which is rendered in English as a site of memory, S-I-T-E, of memory, or in perhaps more vivid imagery as a realm or a container of memory. I like that idea of a container of memory. It's kind of neat. The idea is that any significant entity, whether material or non-material, may become a symbolic element of a group's identity through its collective memory. So let me just give you some examples. Obviously, monuments and plaques and historical markers, a cemetery. Now there's a whole bunch of collective memories for you, collected in one place. Public art, murals, sculptures, street theater, even graffiti. These are public expressions of some group's experience. Historic sites and documents, these are records of our memories. Our laws are built on our human memory of right and wrong and justice. Literature and storytelling. Music. Music is a nonverbal method of conveying our collective memories through song and dance, and then there's architecture. Well, today we must include the internet in our examples because it too functions as a collective, both as a group and as a gathering tool for collective memories. For example, hashtags collect a whole lot of memories on one little bitty subject. Think back to the English words that we use for the concept of lieu de mémoire, site or realm or container. The internet is all of those things. And just as with physical objects, documents and paintings and buildings, the digital memories of the internet must be evaluated for preservation. But who gets to decide what will be preserved on the internet? And how can we retrieve lost memories? I'm sure there's a way. These are questions we need to look at. Well, I have included on the back side of your handout a little list of questions called Ways to Look at a Site of Memory. I just thought it might be kind of a fun exercise and maybe helpful to ask yourself these questions whenever you feel like you're in, looking at a visible site of memory or listening to some music that represents a group's folk song or whatever. So you can ask yourself, what is it? Is it a monument or a song or a document? What is its purpose? Who created it? What group sponsored it? How was it funded? Where is it located? Whose space does it occupy? What story does it tell us? How does it make you feel? How do you think it makes others feel? Does it divide or unite? Well, just as memory is fluid and ever-changing, so too is the way that we see memory. The monuments and museums and memorials that we grew up with may present an outdated, an incomplete, or even an incorrect viewpoint today. So museum planners have adopted several new methods for telling a story, ranging from such things as living history presentations and makers exhibits to augmented reality experiences. And similarly, there are trends in memorial design that include honoring the victims or the ordinary participants in an event rather than the victors or the famous, utilizing architectural rather than a sculptural design, producing a more comprehensive experience or journey for the viewer rather than like a static encounter with some object, taking a therapeutic or not a triumphalist tone, and creating a platform for people to participate in the memorialization by bringing their own life experiences and hopefully taking away something new. And I'll describe a couple of examples of that, of all of these. So, I invite you to take a brief excursion with me to a few sites of memory and to pay attention to what is included, what is excluded, and has it changed over time. So I'm going to begin with a woman who some of you may know. She was a Floridian, Zora Neale Hurston. Have any of you read any of her books? Oh, good, wonderful. She lived from 1891 to 1960. She was a Harlem Renaissance writer and an American folklorist. Well, you might be curious why I have included her. Does this exactly fit together? Well, I'll tell you how it does. She was the author of a novel set in Florida, probably her best-known piece of writing, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And she also wrote an autobiography called Dust Tracks on a Road. Neither book received the acclaim that they deserved during her lifetime. She was basically ignored. She spent her last years in Fort Pierce, Florida, where she died in a home for colored indigents, as they put it. Her friends collected $600 for a very nice funeral, but her body lay in an unmarked grave in the Black Cemetery for 15 years. Finally, Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple, became interested in this woman, and she went in search of where Zora Neale Hurston's remains might be. And she found them. She found the place documented in the cemetery records. So she purchased a headstone, and she wrote an article about it for Ms. Magazine, and that finally brought Hurston into the public's attention. Well, over time, the city of Fort Pierce, prodded by activists in the Black community, joined together to commemorate this woman who has been called the genius of the South. And they erected markers on something called the Zora Neale Hurston Dust Tracks Heritage Trail. The title is almost longer than the trail, sadly. There are only 8 markers, but this is still a very significant thing because they note places that were relevant to Hurston's life in Fort Pierce, but perhaps more importantly, these markers also encode her history into the city's memory by revealing how Black life thrived there on its own during the days of segregation. Efforts are ongoing to establish a museum and a community center in her honor, and one can hope that this signals a reframing of collective memory in Fort Pierce and in other places too. So I would say that this first stop on our tour of visible memories, sites of memory, is an example of hidden memories which are made visible. Our next stop is the Golden Spike National Historic Park in Promontory, Utah. Has anybody ever been there? Oh, wonderful. 2 people, I'm surprised. I haven't been. It commemorates an event that occurred on May 10th, 1869. And the way the park is structured, it's basically a place where you go to see a reenactment. So you sit and as you sit waiting for this to happen, you hear the sound of a steam locomotive blowing its whistle and driving across the wide open landscape of northern Utah. This begins the authentic reenactment of the driving of the final spike into the railroad tie, which created the first transcontinental railroad in the world. Well, that's really a pretty important event if you think about it, but it's not something we really talk about much anymore. So, you might be wondering, is there really a golden spike? Well, yes, but not here. It is in a museum at Stanford University. The site commemorates not only this one-day event, but also, in a larger sense, the patriotic spirit of the post-Civil War era, at a time when the national recovery was led by the big railroad capitalists and their grand dreams. So Leland Stanford, president of one of those railroads, he had the honor of hammering the last blow into that railroad tie. And a telegraph signal went out, and the nation went wild. Church bells rang, trains hooted, and cannons thundered. Orators declared this a great day of national destiny. Well, today, NPS rangers cajole the tourists at the reenactment to simulate this patriotic mood. Be enthusiastic. Oh, like other aspects of this memorial, it just maybe doesn't seem genuine. So what is missing? Well, here's an alternative. Perhaps a brand new golden spike installed just a few months ago. This one, 43 feet long instead of 5.5 inches, is more representative of this whole idea. Its immensity alone conveys the mood in 1869 better than the few small relics on display at the National Historic Park. This spike or sculpture is being installed outside of the park along an interstate highway. So it serves both to guide visitors into the national park and to offer a reinterpretation of its history. Carved in relief on the 4 sides of the huge spike are images that tell the more complete story of building the railroads. One side depicts the impact of the railroad on indigenous populations. And you can imagine that's been an undertold story. The other 3 sides show the faces representing the groups who contributed to the railroad's completion. Chinese and Irish immigrants, freed Black laborers, Civil War veterans, and members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. Can you think of a more diverse group to work together? The sculptor Duve Bloomberg was motivated by his own heritage as the descendant of Dutch and Jewish immigrants to portray the complexity of American heritage. The Golden Spike Foundation, which is a Utah nonprofit, commissioned the monument not to compete with the national park, but to add to it. So this is a site of memory that expands the story, and it also honors the laborers. Our third stop on our journey is the Whitney Plantation in Edgar, Louisiana. Has anyone been there? Oh, good. 2 people. Well, I have not yet visited this site. It is, however, of great personal interest, as you can imagine, because I lived in New Orleans for over 30 years, and I have toured many plantation homes in Louisiana. Until 2014, the story told by Southern plantations was universally that of planter aristocracy. This one is different. It tells the story of the enslaved people who labored on the plantations and brought wealth to the South. The narrative of the plantation itself is a fascinating tangle of Black-white relations. The white female owner of the plantation from 1840 to 1860 was the aunt of an enslaved man of mixed race, whose descendants include the wife of the first Black mayor of New Orleans and their son, Mark Morial, who is currently the president of the National Urban League. Wow. Of equal interest is how the property was rescued by one very wealthy white man with both the means and the passion to restore the plantation house and its outbuildings. John Cummings realized just how little he knew about the institution of slavery. And so, to his credit, he embarked on a 14-year research and restoration program, investing $15 million in a museum that would focus entirely on the lives of enslaved people. Whitney Plantation opened its doors in 2014, and Cummings did eventually donate the property to a nonprofit foundation. So this is an example of a place that tells a different story. It lets other voices speak. Okay, now I'm coming to a site that I'm sure all of you have either been to or at least have seen hundreds of pictures of it, and that is the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Just see a show of hands. How many of you have ever been to the Lincoln Memorial? Okay, pretty much everyone. It was dedicated in 1922, and that year is significant in the history of our race relations, really. The revision of Abraham Lincoln, though, let's start at that story. It seems to never end. From the Civil War through the end of the 19th century, he was the defender of the Union. Well, that played both positively and negatively. In the early 20th century, through the 1940s, he became the great emancipator, and his image was used to promote the New Deal and its many programs. Yet, he was also the staple of Republican Party rhetoric, and of Black civil rights workers, and even of left-wing activists. The Mexican muralist, I thought this was a kind of interesting little side story, Diego Rivera, he wanted to pair Lincoln and Lenin in a fresco at Rockefeller Center. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Well, that idea didn't fly. But Lincoln did, in a movie, teamed up with Shirley Temple, with whom he shared an apple, and then he freed her father, a falsely accused Confederate spy, from prison. In recent years, poor Mr. Lincoln, he has been beatified and reviled and interrogated from every possible point of view. We could say that Lincoln, the person, has become the all-purpose Lincoln, the persona. The sites of memory related to Lincoln are just as varied. But let's look at just this one, Lincoln Memorial. This neoclassical temple, it's truly a beautiful structure. It speaks symbolically of Lincoln as the defender of the Union and the great emancipator. It has those beautiful, strong columns. I mean, you just know they're going to stand forever. And, you know, the words of Lincoln displayed on the wall around him. Lincoln, so adaptable in our collective memory, sits carved in stone, unchanging. At its dedication in 1922, the segregated audience heard speeches lauding our nation's great past and future. The only Black speaker was told to alter his remarks significantly to fit to the organizer's narrative. Yet today, the Lincoln Memorial, gosh, how do we think of the Lincoln Memorial today? I view it as a sacred space in our nation's cultural history. Although the building has not changed at all, its meaning has altered and flowed through our collective memory of the civil rights struggle. From Marian Anderson's Easter Sunday performance in 1939 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, and the historic I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr., the classical structure has accumulated an emotional power never imagined by its builders. So today, this lieu de mémoire is regarded as the symbol of our right to freedom of speech. And I would say that this place has altered the meaning of its original builders by its ever-changing memories. And so we're going to end our little tour with a place that is new, but it represents a historical period that we don't like to talk about. This is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, opened in 2018. How many of you have been there? Oh, good. Well, it's on my bucket list, but I haven't been there yet. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice, also called the National Lynching Memorial, is the nation's first comprehensive memorial dedicated to the legacy of Black Americans who were enslaved, terrorized by lynching, humiliated by racial segregation, and presumed guilty and dangerous. That's from their mission statement. Every detail of the design of this property memorializes those who have never been properly named or mourned. Defined as sacred space for truth-telling, the memorial demands a reckoning with one of the nation's least recognized atrocities. Both the museum and the memorial ask the viewer to question who must be held accountable and what truths must be told by engaging in memory activism. The design of the memorial takes the visitor on a journey through a narrative sequence called the Stages of Transformation, from identity to discomfort, to proximity and transformation, and finally to hope. In the identity stage, visitors enter and engage face-to-face with 800 hanging steel columns, one for each county where a lynching occurred between 1877 and 1950. The names of 4,000 400 victims of lynching are engraved on the markers, a stand-in for headstones that were so rarely given to these victims. The floor gradually descends down a ramp so that the markers rise above the visitors' heads, creating discomfort, simulating the posture, and this is painful, of spectators in old photographs. And you know what I'm talking about. In the third stage, proximity, the markers are consolidated overhead in an amphitheater, bringing visitors to a place to pause and reflect on their discomfort. Stage 4 is a work of imagination leading to transformation as visitors walk past a wall of water dedicated to all the unknown victims of lynching. And from there, the visitor is invited to climb a hill at the center of the memorial, rising above the markers and symbolically calling the visitor to action and to hope. So this was, I think, the most brilliant part of the planning of this memorial. In a future-oriented plan, the memorial aims to propagate a whole range of local memorials across the country using duplicates of the 800 markers, which are laid out like coffins in a field. The counties listed on the markers as sites of lynching are invited to come and retrieve the duplicate marker for their county in order to create a local memorial which is close to the actual site. According to the memorial statement, the final monument will be to have all the markers distributed throughout the U.S. to places that choose to confront the history and take responsibility for the truth. This is both, without a doubt, provocation and a shaming of those counties who fail to retrieve their marker and thus refuse to acknowledge their complicity. The distributed and dynamic nature of the memorial over time will tell a counter-narrative to the dominant white supremacy identity of our past and present. But does this one memorial suggest that a nation's collective memory can be reframed? Seems like kind of a leap. But Marita Sturgeon, in her book Terrorism in American Memory, says yes. She writes, the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice are emblematic of the turn in the early 2000s in the national conversation about race. Now, we might dispute that, but she gives some very good reasons for why she sees this very subtle and gradual shift and takes great hope from this. So I would say that this National Memorial for Peace and Justice demands truth-telling, and that is its role as a site of memory. There are a few other examples of changes. A Katrina Memorial, created in 2008 in New Orleans, is dedicated to all those who suffered and died in the hurricane. The remains of dozens of victims were never identified, and some were never claimed. They are buried here beneath a monument designed to evoke the shape of a hurricane. It creates a meditative labyrinth and a place of reflection for healing. On the eve of the inauguration of President Biden in 2021, a memorial service at the Lincoln Memorial featured rows of lights spread out alongside the reflecting pool. They were illuminated in memory of and in national recognition of those lost to COVID-19. Pandemics, they're hardly ever memorialized. But just a few years earlier, the AIDS epidemic was acknowledged and remembered by the largest community arts project in history, the AIDS Quilt. and it is still ongoing. Such expansive memorials demand that we participate in mourning and remembering the victims of disaster and disease, many of whom were the most vulnerable citizens among us. The removal of Confederate memorials is another example of a broad shift in narrative. In 2020, the Southern Poverty Law Center documented 2,089 memorials throughout the U.S., each one narrating the lost cause and white supremacy in its own way. These included monuments, roadways, schools, counties and municipalities, parks, buildings, military bases, license plates, bodies of water, bridges, we could go on. The SPLC continues to maintain a comprehensive and publicly accessible database of these memorials, and that in its own way is a lieu de mémoire, a site of memory. So these last examples that I've given you represent new topics and community participation and the ongoing nature of how we remember, how we have our collective memories made visible. Excuse me just a minute, I'm getting a little dry here. So, repairing our memories. I no longer need to ask if it is possible to change the collective memory and tell a different story because, well, yes, it is happening all the time. We've just talked about that. I want to share with you a book that I read recently, which gives me hope. And I would say that this is an example of literature and storytelling as collective memory. Ben Raines is a white boat captain, an environmental journalist, and the author of The Last Slave Ship, with a very long subtitle, The True Story of How Clotilda Was Found, Her Descendants, and an Extraordinary Reckoning. It kind of tells you exactly what the book is about. Living outside of Mobile, Alabama, Raines became curious about the Clotilda, the ship that carried the last cargo of enslaved people from Ouida in today's Benin in West Africa to the shores of Alabama in 1860. This was long after it was outlawed. Didn't matter. This was the result of a wager. Ben Raines hunted the ship, and he did eventually, after a lot of searching, a lot of misdirected paths, he found its hull resting deep in the mud of a secluded swamp in the Mobile River. It is still there. There is talk of trying to raise it. It's going to be very difficult because it is extremely fragile, but it may eventually be brought to land. And this is the real story of the Clotilda, I think. Unlike so many enslaved persons in America, many of the names of the Clotilda passengers are known. They are real to us. They have names, both American and African. Their tribes and villages can be identified. More importantly, though, their stories survive today in their descendants. Always regarded with suspicion and maybe a little bit of dislike by other enslaved persons, the Clotilda passengers, after emancipation, during Reconstruction, they purchased land. They pooled their money and they purchased land, which is kind of remarkable. And they established their own community. It was known as Africatown. They ruled themselves with an elected leader and a set of laws based on their African village codes. For a time, Africatown thrived as a shining example of interdependence, education, and entrepreneurship. They understood that all they had was each other, says Altaviz Rosario, who is vice president of the Clotilda Descendants Association. They had to learn a new life and to build a new life for themselves and their families, and they knew that they could only do that by staying as one cohesive group. And that was passed down from generation to generation in a collective memory that is really significant. Then, like so many other Black communities, the village was severed by a highway and a bridge. Its safety and economy crashed in the 1980s, affected deeply by both Reaganomics and the crack epidemic. And the descendants of the Clotilda slaves hid their identities from shame at their slave past. Slowly, that is changing. Raines concluded the book with a powerful account of the reckoning between the slave trader and the owners of the ship with the descendants of the Clotilda passengers. For this, Raines traveled to Benin to see firsthand how that nation has publicly confessed its part, seeking to heal ancient wounds of the stolen at the hands of the thieves who took so much from them. While such inspiring work has not happened yet in Alabama, where the Meir family, descendants of the perpetrators of the crime, the man who made the bet and his brothers who helped him achieve it, they refused to admit any part of their role in the last slave ship. The story, though, has not yet ended. As one of the Clotilda descendants said, after meeting the descendant of the captain of the boat, maybe seeing a descendant of a slave from the Clotilda and the descendant of the slaver who brought the people from Ouida, seeing us together, laughing and hugging, maybe that can help them heal too. So this gives us the way forward and a reckoning. Like sightseers, we have paused at many places tonight. I hope you will take home a few memories of the trip, but the hard work lies ahead. For now, we must journey toward a path of healing for our fractured world. Once again, we look to Isaiah's prophecy to Israel, mired in its Babylonian captivity and exile. The verses just before the ones which started our quest tell Israel to look to the past and remember the great things that God did for Israel. Well, then in a turnabout, we hear the familiar words, do not remember the former things or consider the things of old, for God is about to do a new thing. Through common sense, backed up by psychology, we know that forgetting the past is impossible. How inextricably interwoven the past is in the present. How heavily that past bears on the future, wrote Jesmyn Ward in The Fire This Time. Yet when we stay in the past, mired in failure, or nostalgia, or what we wish to believe were past glories, we are held captive. The potential for harm is there to ourselves and to others. Our memories can hold us back, or they can guide us forward into the future, leaving behind our polarizing captivity and moving us toward compassionate community. In her book, This Here Flesh, Cole Arthur Riley writes of the importance of storytelling, which is, in essence, memory sharing. When the role of historian is shared by a diversity of voices, the process of curating stories becomes truer and more just. This habit of curating collective memory can not only preserve community, but also in the darkest of moments, resurrect it. few would deny that storytelling is core to what it means to be human. It's been going on as long as there have been humans. In the Bible, God asks us to remember and tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children. Storytelling or memory sharing is good for us. So let's make sure that we tell good stories. So the path forward is what we seek, but it won't magically appear. Each one of us must do the hard work of building the path and following it. So let's look for a word that will help us in our search. Let's start with a word you've heard quite a few times tonight, remember. Well, it's a word in two parts, although we don't often think of it that way. Member, from the Indo-European base, means to mind or to think. And from the Latin root, that little handy-dandy re that appears in front of so many English words, it means back or again. Back or again. It's kind of like two heads of the same coin. Well, the dual action of mentally going back while also bringing a memory forward into our consciousness has a name. It's called remembering forward. In scriptural terms, it is the perception of the new thing that God is doing. But it takes more than remembering to build that path toward healing. So I have chosen to think of it as a process of repairing. Repair acts to restore or renew what is torn or broken, to make good. Embedded in its Latin roots is the deep understanding of back and again, combined with the action of producing or even of giving birth. In another form of collective memory, we turn to a Japanese art form which can teach us how to repair. The art of kintsugi teaches that we are to mend to make new rather than to fix. The artist Makoto Fujimura explains that one seeks to mend fractures in pottery and to make them more beautiful by first beholding them. That's the truth-telling. We have to see the broken places. And then, using lacquer and gold, the most beautiful materials we can imagine, to accentuate the beauty of fractures rather than hiding them. The art of yobitsugi goes beyond kintsugi by intentionally bringing fragments from different sources together to create a porcelain patchwork. It doesn't match, but it makes a beautiful whole. So, like a broken bowl, we must consider the ways that we can repair our broken relationships to make them good and whole and beautiful again. It can be done. But how? What tools do we have? Well, that is the challenge that I give you. And I leave you with some discussion questions on the table. I hope you will take the opportunity to look over these lists of questions, pick out maybe one or two, or if you have time and the inclination to go through all of them, that would be great. But just to discuss what you think, how we can repair these fractured relationships that are so